When the holidays start to feel a bit repetitive, reach for a Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry and put your twist on tradition. A bold cranberry and winter spice flavor fusion, Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry is a refreshing way to shake things up this sipping season. And only for a limited time. Sprite, obey your thirst.
Welcome to the Marvel Mindset, a podcast from ex-Marvel CEO Peter Cuneo. Listen as Peter shares inside stories of what it took to turn around Marvel. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Well, welcome back. This is episode 3 of our series on the Marvel Mindset, talking about how Marvel achieved its turnaround. So today I'd like to talk about my perspective on walking in the front door of Marvel as the new CEO and some of the things that were important to me in evaluating what changes and so on needed to be done. And then after we do that, we're going to be talking about what's a successful turnaround. How did we know that we were doing well at Marvel when we knew? So when I joined Marvel in the summer of 1999, the company had come out of bankruptcy recently. And naturally, there was an atmosphere of great uncertainty, even fear about the future of the business. As I mentioned previously, a lot of talent had left the company. One of the problems that we discovered, the financial situation, the arrangement coming out of bankruptcy was far from perfect. And there was a great deal of consternation about what's the future going to look like for the company. Investors were still very concerned about the company and whether we would go back into bankruptcy. And as CEO of a public company, I had to deal with not only the employees and other interested parties like suppliers and partners in the motion picture business, comic books, but also the uncertainty with our employees and investors. So I was recently asked, Peter, do you have a playbook that you open up when you go into a turnaround situation? As I mentioned previously, I've been engaged in a number of turnaround challenges. And is there a standard approach you take when you walk through the door and start evaluating what's going on? And frankly, I never had a standard playbook. I always viewed each situation different industry, different challenges, different employees, different geography. So I could never figure out how to have a standard playbook that I would just check the boxes and fill in the blanks. It was all very different. And the biggest thing, of course, in evaluating turnaround is as soon as you can, you want to have a strategic model for the company, the organization going forward. And you want to have also a change model. How are you going to make changes? What will they be like? And how will they be coordinated? Again, these are both different in every situation. So you have to keep an open mind. My strategic model was very interesting, I think, because after some months with the company, I had a wagon wheel in the back of my head. And in the wagon wheel, the hub of the wheel was the intellectual property, the assets of Marvel. So we're talking about 4,700 characters when I joined the company. And yes, not all of them were ever going to be rejuvenated, but lots of intellectual property, a treasure chest, in my opinion, of characters that could lead to a great future. But going back to the wheel, the spokes of the wheel are how you monetize that intellectual property or your assets that are in the hub. When I joined Marvel, it was only really 1.5 spokes. One spoke was the comic book publishing business, and the other spoke was a semi-broken, cracked licensing business. And that was it, 1.5 spokes when I joined Marvel. And of course, it didn't take a genius to figure out that if we added the right additional spokes, we'd have success. And in fact, after 3 months on the job, I did a big deal on video games with Activision. The deal involved 3 or 4 of our major A-list characters, like Spider-Man. And that added another spoke to the wheel. And maybe the biggest spoke of all, in a sense, certainly one of the biggest, came a year after I came to the company when we premiered X-Men 1. It was a huge hit. And I'll talk more about X-Men 1 later on, but it was a huge hit that added a motion picture spoke. And that at the same time fixed the licensing spoke, because along with major motion pictures, there's usually a lot of exciting licensing, particularly in the case of Marvel in the toy area, but many, many other areas as well. And so suddenly we had 4 healthy spokes after a year. So our wheel, if you will, had gone from very shaky. In fact, I don't think you could have even put our wheel to work at all with 1.5 spokes when I came. But a year later, we had a nice solid wheel of 4 spokes. And I like to say that later on, when we sold to Disney, many years later, we had probably 15 spokes on the wheel. We were a powerhouse. We could have put that wheel on any vehicle, anything that we wanted, and provide the power and be successful. So I think the model of the wheel could be applied actually to a lot of different situations, businesses, both for profit and not, where you have your assets in the middle of the wheel, in the hub. You have the ways that you want to work with other people to enhance those assets, sometimes to make money, sometimes not. And then you have the synergy on the rim. The synergy on the rim was very important for Marvel, because if someone went to the movies, well, they'd probably buy the toys for their kids. Or if they're a comic book fan, they probably go to the movie or play the video games, and on and on and on. And so in the end, the rim of the wheel was the most important part of all. And it worked out very well. So that was my strategic model, so to speak, for Marvel. But I also needed what I'll call a change model, because all of these turnarounds need substantial change. What do they need? And when and how can you make the changes? We'll break for a moment, then continue the story.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
So I like to think about my change model at Marvel. And again, I think this would apply to a lot of businesses and non-businesses as well, where change is required, was a pond in the countryside. So think of the pond as the organization, the entity, in this case, Marvel. And you know that if you drop a pebble in the pond, it makes a little ripple. That's a little change. That ripple doesn't last more than a few seconds, and then it's gone. If you drop a rock in, or throw a rock, or try to skip rocks, as I did when I was a kid, you've got bigger changes, and there's definitely some upset in the surface of the pond, but eventually that fades too. If somehow a boulder was to be thrown or launched into the pond, this is a gigantic change. Its wave will affect every inch of the pond. It will push water up on the shoreline of the pond, and is a very, very gigantic, almost cataclysmic change. That was my model for change. What I realized is you have to time changes so that the ripple effects or the waves of these different changes, based on how big and important those changes were, should not interfere with each other. If you've ever been near a pond and threw a couple of rocks near each other or whatever, you see that the waves intersect each other and they form a bigger wave. So in organizations, making changes is an art form, and the timing is very important. So let me give you a few examples of a pebble, a rock, and a boulder for Marvel. A pebble would be something that doesn't affect the organization too long and is pretty easy to accomplish. In the case of Marvel, I would say an example would be moving our office space. During the time I was with Marvel, we were in 3 different offices, moving up, getting larger and nicer accommodations over that 10 years. But all the offices were in the central area of Manhattan. Didn't put any onus on the employees to have to move their families because of a new office or anything like that. Pretty easy to change. And so after some of the fuss that comes with physically moving, a month or 2 later, people could hardly remember where they were before. That's a pebble. An example of a rock would be changing your product line or adding to your product line. So a good example at Marvel was a decision that we made in the comic book business that was designed to attract new comic book fans, new people to the comic book world of comic books. One of the problems that we recognized with comic books at the time was that it's very hard for new readers to come in and really appreciate fully the characters when they would come in at issue number 200 of Spider-Man. We had been telling Spider-Man stories for years and years and years. Spider-Man actually was created in 1961 for Marvel. So there'd been a lot of stuff. And the origin story and understanding the origin story and the real character of our superheroes was very important to getting new fans emotionally connected to our characters. So we decided that we'd bring out a new line of comic books called Marvel Ultimates. And I just happen to have one here to show you. This is the Spider-Man comic that we brought out. Basically, the Ultimates started the story of our major characters from the beginning. So in the case of Spider-Man, it was all about how Peter Parker got his spider abilities. It was his life in high school and other things. And with very little changes. In Spider-Man's case, Spider-Man was bitten by a genetically altered spider to get his powers. In 1961, he was bitten by a spider that had been nuked, and so on and so forth. So a few differences. Spider-Man had when we brought out Ultimate, Spider-Man had a cell phone. He obviously didn't have a cell phone in 1961. But basically, the fundamental underpinnings, what made those characters, Marvel characters, so successful was never changed. It was a big move, and is one of the reasons I think that we rapidly increased our readership in our comic book business, because we were telling stories from the beginning and new fans could appreciate all of that backstory. It was very, very important. That was a rock in the business. And a boulder, and I'm sure the biggest boulder that we had for Marvel was starting our own studio in 2006. Actually, Marvel had created Marvel Studios in the early 90s, but had not been successful at all. It had not worked at that time. So we weren't really creating Marvel Studios. We were rejuvenating Marvel Studios. And I'll be talking a lot more about that in detail in later episodes here. But basically, that is the boulder in the pond. Now we're going to be making our own movies. We're not dependent on other big studios. We had learned, we had apprenticed, if you will, on the sets and so on with other studios, these big studios. And we now had the skills or could hire the talent, just like studios do, to make a film. And that we could make them better and, frankly, cheaper than the big studios did. That was a gigantic change, as you imagine, affected every corner of our business. And we also had a lot of people feeling uncertain about us. There was a lot of criticism about us going out and doing our own studio. What made us think that we could do it better than big studios that had been in existence for 80 years? A lot of our investors thought we were pretty arrogant. And I knew this firsthand because when we brought out Marvel Studios, I was vice chairman of the board, and one of my jobs was investor relations. I was the person going out representing the company at conferences, talking to individual investors as well, and telling our story. A lot of skepticism about Marvel taking that risk. But of course, as we all know, it worked out quite well, needless to say. Well, that's it for today. I just want to say thank you very much. We'll be on again next Monday, as promised, with more about Marvel and the Marvel mindset. I'm Peter Cuneo. Thanks for joining us.
Been out here all morning. Not a single bite. Guess the fish finally figured it out. Just like hackers do when Cisco Duo's on guard. With Duo's end-to-end phishing resistance, every login, every device, every user stays protected. No hooks, no catches, no bites. Cisco Duo. Phishing season is over. Learn more at duo.com.